Just in order here, first we have Liz Hood from the Toronto Botanical Gardens, Joe Castrilli from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, Andre Fliss, who is a beekeeper, and at the very end, Oliver Couto, who is also an urban beekeeper. And just in the interest of full transparency, Oliver and I are both members of the Toronto Beekeepers Cooperative. So we'll just start, we'll just go in order, and they'll each take just a couple of minutes to tell you about themselves and what they do with bees.
Hi. I am the Director of Education at the Toronto Botanical Garden, and I actually I started to learn more about bees through the Toronto Beekeepers Cooperative at an info night many years ago. And at that point, I thought it would be wonderful to bring bees to the TBG. And so we've started, we're starting our 4th season, keeping bees at the garden. And we are also entering our 4th season of an urban beekeeping series. So we do beekeepers training specifically for urban contexts. Oliver's one of our instructors, and he's one of my first teachers. So so we've been doing that. This year is the very first year that we'll be offering an urban beekeeping certificate. Beekeepers can get a chance to learn about the entire beekeeping season, from basic biology of bees to planting and tending a pollinator garden, hive checks, honey harvests, how to wrap your bees up and get them ready for winter. And then there's a proficiency check so that you can get your certificate. And we're hoping to actually see other organizations throughout the city who are either keeping bees or are offering training that we'll all be sharing in the same certificate, so we'll be adding to it over time. So that's probably enough for me.
My name is Joe Castrilli. I'm a lawyer at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. The acronym is CELA or CELA. We're a legal aid clinic, and we represent folks who have environmental problems who cannot otherwise afford a lawyer, and we also advocate environmental law reforms. We have a number of areas that we focus on from time to time, and one of the areas we've been involved in over the last few years is food security, preservation of agricultural land, and also the issue of pesticides. I think probably that's enough for me for the moment.
My name's Andre Flies. I'm a beekeeper. I guess what many people would call a commercial beekeeper, certainly not the size of the scale that you saw Mr. Miller there operating. We have about 500 colonies of bees just north of the city here in Nobleton. I'm also a board member of the Ontario Beekeepers Association, who you may have been familiar with if you signed a petition this summer urging our government to take action against pesticides. So that's for me.
Hi, I'm Oliver Couto. I'm an urban beekeeper. I'm manager of the Bee Shop, located on Bloor Street near Lansdowne. And I'm one of the instructors of the beekeeping course, as Liz mentioned, at the Toronto Botanical Garden. And I'm also a film producer, producing a film series called The Sacred Bee that gently unites the world's major faiths through the paradigm of the honeybee.
Liz and I are going to share this microphone. As I said, I've got a couple of questions, and then if you can prepare your questions, I think Maggie has a microphone so she can go around. So in a couple of minutes, I'll be asking you to just raise your hand so that Maggie can get to you and you can ask your questions. So to bring the film a little closer to home, I just thought maybe you could start, I'm not sure exactly who, but certainly at least a couple of you, on commenting on what sort of colony collapse or bee die-off we're seeing in Canada and in Ontario. So do you want to start with that? Andre?
Sure.
Oliver?
So what we, the world has coined colony collapse disorder. I don't agree with that term. I think it's a convenient term that's been thrown around, and nobody will admit to knowing what it is. What we see here in Quebec and Ontario, the science is out there now. What it's pointing to is this treatment that's being put on seeds for corn and soybeans. And corn is a really big problem. 99% of the corn grown here in Ontario and Quebec has a treated, it's treated with a systemic pesticide called neonicotinoids. There are many different names depending on who makes it. But it's persistent in the soil after it's been planted. It's in the water that runs off from these fields in high enough levels that if bees or other pollinators drink from that water running off from these fields, they die or they have sublethal effects, and the drones don't produce viable sperm, and the queens can't lay viable larvae, viable eggs. So what we call colony collapse, it is there collapsing. It's not a mystery when we talk about what's going on here in Ontario and Quebec. It is the pesticides that are put onto the corn and the soybeans. It's inescapable. We cannot move our bees. If you drive around anywhere outside of Toronto and you look at what's being planted in the fields, it is almost all of it corn. And when it's not corn, it's soybeans. It is just inescapable. Literally can't drive 2 minutes without passing a cornfield anymore.
So just to follow along from that, Oliver, one of the things I've heard is that the urban bees are actually doing better than rural bees, maybe partly because of the lack of pesticides here?
What you have in the city of Toronto, at least, the pesticides have been banned. So the urban hives, depending on the forage you get, can do better than in the rural areas lately due to the systemic pesticides. That is true, yes.
Okay, and then this probably leads us to the petition that I think Andre was referring to. So, Joe, do you want to talk a little bit about what's happening at the federal level with what you're doing?
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm not involved in the petition, but last September, on behalf of a national environmental group, we filed a notice of objection under federal pesticide law to the renewal of a conditional registration for one of the neonicotinoids. Its name is sufficiently long that I can't pronounce it, but it's part of the family of insecticides that Andre was talking about. And the particular insecticide is one of a number that have actually been banned for 2 years by the European Commission because of the concerns they had, both the European Food Safety Authority and the European Commission, about the impact that this family of insecticides is having on not only honeybees, but all pollinators. And so there's an interesting contrast between what's going on in Canada and what's going on in Europe. In Europe, they said, well, you know, we're missing some key studies that would tell us whether it's a good or a bad idea to continue to have these insecticides on the market, and so we're going to ban them for 2 years while we study the impacts in a much more controlled manner. Canada's approach is to say, well, you know what, we're missing all of the same studies that Europe is missing, but instead of banning them for banning the insecticides for 2 years, we're going to continue to use them and wait to see what the studies produce as a result. If you were a bee, would you rather live in Europe or in Canada? I think the short answer is that our approach may well see a much greater impact on bee populations over the next 2 years than what may eventually be the results in Europe. At the moment, we don't have an answer from the federal health minister. It's like a petition in the United States, but here it's called a notice of objection. Hasn't been responded to in 4 months. We're waiting. Eventually, if the minister never responds, we have the option of going to another forum to deal with her non-response. But at the moment, we're still waiting to see if she will respond.
And Andre, can you comment on what's happening with the Ontario provincial government?
Well, the Premier had set up a bee health working group. There's about 34 members on that group. Unfortunately, only about 4 of them are beekeepers. The rest of them are grain farmers or pesticide company representatives. What's come out of that working group is unfortunately a whole pile of nothing. What they're recommending is changing the labeling on the packaging of the chemicals so that the farmers are aware that this stuff kills honeybees, which, again, I mean, I don't see how that's going to help anybody. I'm sure they're aware of it to begin with, and if it's that harmful, then why are we putting it into our environment? They're looking at it from a dust perspective when they're planting. We know this is, you may have seen some of this in the news, particularly a man by the name of David Schuett. He lost most of his bees in one spring corn planting from the dust that was coming out of one of these corn planters. So they're looking at it from that angle, but they're not looking at it from a pervasive water and soil and something that never leaves the environment. Sometimes the stuff after one application of corn planting can stay in the soil for up to 15 years. So unfortunately, we keep being told by the Premier that they want to act based on science-based solutions. Well, there's over 150 studies out there showing that the science behind this is, it's not just killing our bees. Again, it is our entire biomass when it comes to insects are in danger. There's a few studies that you may want to look at. There's a lady by the name of Christy Morrissey. She's a professor at University of Saskatchewan, and she's proven that not only when the plants are in the ground, but the spring runoff the following year, these puddles and swamps and wetlands is killing the invertebrates inside those swamps and wetlands. They're dying. They're not surviving. And in turn, the songbirds that eat and rely upon those invertebrates are also dying. So the science is there with that. This study is still emerging. It hasn't been released, but she did a presentation to us not long ago. Christian Rupke, he's out of Purdue University. He also is proving the exact same things that are going on. And we know that the chemical companies are a little excited when they're releasing papers counteracting anything that these folks do. So unfortunately, I don't think the answers for this are going to come from the government unless there is mass public outcry, because unfortunately the 65,000 signatures that we collected from Ontarians and from people across Canada and even the United States from over this summer that were handed over to the Premier just before Christmas, we got a nice letter responding back saying thanks, but we're waiting for the federal government to see what they're going to do. So even though the Premier has the power to act and to do something here in this province and to take action, she's not. She's taking advice from the other side. So. We need people to get out there and we need to talk about it. And we need to, if you want to learn more about it, if you go to OntarioBee.com, there's a lot of information there about exactly what's happening with, you can point you to the research and to the people at the PMRA, Pesticide Management Registration Agency, which is our equivalent of the EPA here. But one of the things you can certainly do is to contact your MP or MPP and let them know that you're concerned. Because until they hear from more than 65,000 of us, I'm afraid they're not going to do anything. And we are, as a commercial industry in Ontario and Quebec, on the verge of collapse. It is that serious. Nobody I know out there is willing to invest any more money in their businesses. Hobby beekeepers will continue at it. They can afford, it's a hobby, to keep, if your bees are dead in the spring, spend a couple of $100s and get them going again. But for someone like myself, 500 colonies, and every year you're losing 30–40% of them, and another 10% over the winter. It's just unsustainable. We can't keep at it.
So, having heard that we can't really have our governments, trust them to do much, I think Liz can tell us a little bit about things that we personally can do to help the health of the bees.
Ooh, I have a tall order. The cities are becoming these sort of oases for bees and pollinators. I know we're talking about honeybees tonight, but I think it's important to broaden this conversation to all pollinators. There's so many different varieties of bees that you might not recognize as bees because they're blue or green, and any other bug and invertebrate that plays this important role. So. Cities around the world have really embraced urban beekeeping. It's become quite chic. So London and New York City all have this enormous boom of beekeeping, but they also are not restricted in the same ways as we are in Toronto. We have the Ontario Bees Act that covers the whole province, which means that you can't actually keep a hive any closer than 30 meters setback from a residence, which basically means you need an acre. And you need to have your, so for those of us who are interested in keeping bees within the city limits, that's going to be a tough situation. At the Toronto Botanical Garden, we're fortunate we have a little bit of space to stretch out. You'll often hear about bees on rooftops. But lots of places, London, I think in particular, England, there were studies, reports coming out from bee pollinator organizations urging people to stop keeping bees as a hobby because they felt that there was insufficient forage for the number of bees that were now inhabiting the city. So So we're not alone we've got a city full of people who I think are really engaged and interested in bees who want to help pollinators. We talk a lot about pollinator gardens, and so I can give you a brief rundown for this group, and if you have more questions, feel free to ask when we have the question period, but simple stuff. Native plants. Native plants are really important. They have this incredible genetic diversity that are going to be able to stretch when we have strange climate events, drought, extra wet summers. They just have a little bit more genetic depth to be able to draw from. The bees are European varieties usually, and they're not specialists, they're generalists, so they'll forage from anything, but your garden is going to do better with native plants. And you want to focus on plants that are blooming as early as possible in the season. So native things like bloodroot or non-native things like crocus, get them as early as possible and then try to extend your bloom as far as possible into October, November. So you want to try to stretch the season. And then also plant your garden with things that will bloom all season long. There's something called calamint, which is an amazing little, it's like a catmint. And that thing starts blooming in June, and it does not stop until there's about 2 inches of snow on it. So it's a great plant for bees. And do really think about planting things in masses. So don't do it in onesies and twosies. You want to really have a garden that has a nice, big floral display so that the bees can come and find it, and it's actually like a significant source of food. And then just for other native bees, think about not cutting your garden back. Leave the things dead standing. Think about a water source. Bees need water. Ground nesting bees, they love sunny east slopes where they can dig their little nests. Wood, lots of bees love to burrow in wood. There's carpenter bees that look like bumblebees, but they're not. And they usually, most people discover them when they're burrowing into their trellises and arbors. So there's all kinds of wonderful things you can do, and I can go on and on about the personal experiments I've had in changing a 15 by 15 foot square yard in my front yard and turning it into a pollinator paradise. And it just takes one season. So ask me about it if you're interested. But those are some good, safe bets.
Great. So are there questions from the audience? If you just want to put your hand up, Maggie's got a microphone here. And come on, somebody's got questions here.
I'll add
There
that
we
you
go.
can leave dandelions too. It's not about what you plant. Sometimes it's about what you leave alone.
Yeah, that's so true.
I just wanted to ask a question about something that was talked about earlier in the film, but didn't really seem to go into detail about how certain bees prefer certain types of like fruit or blossoms, and so it sounded like they go to find that type of plant if it's not where their hive has been located. Is that true, or how does that work?
Bees will work one particular blossom until it's exhausted, and then they'll move on to the next. It's not that there's a particular bee that likes a particular type of blossom. It's just that they'll work one at a time. So you know when they come back with pollen in their baskets, it's all from one source, because while they're on one forage, they will not forage a different type of flower, and that's just through simple expedience. You don't want to, you get used to gathering one type of thing. So you work on that, and then when you're done gathering those, you move on to the next. So that's what they do.
Except for some native bees, which they do. They actually, I'm thinking in particular, there's one that comes out in the early spring. They emerge, they work trout lilies, and then the trout lilies are done, and then they lay their eggs, and then they die. And that's it. And so there's lots of native bees. There's a great book, The Pollinators of Toronto. It was put out by the Suzuki Foundation. It's a lovely little guide. It's about 3 inches square. And we have it in our library at the Botanical Garden. I'm sure you can find it around. Do you carry it at your store, at the bee shop?
No,
okay.
no, I don't, not yet.
It's a good one. And it gives you all the different pollinators that you might be finding in Toronto and their unique dating habits and domiciles. So.
Okay, and I think there's a question up here.
one's a question for Joe. Not that I want to pit farmers against farmers, but it seems like if you've got one farmer using a product that's killing your product, maybe you have a case of some kind. I know in Ontario there's the, oh, what's it called? I just sent it to you. Normal Farm Practices Act, which creates obstacles to actually suing people over farm practices. But I'd just be curious to know, I mean, what does one farmer say to another when you've killed your entire colony because of using a pesticide for corn?
Irrespective of any statute law that might apply, there's always the common law. So if a farmer damaged the business or the land or property of a neighboring bee farm, beekeeper, for example, there might be a cause of action in negligence, there might be a cause of action in private nuisance, there might be a cause of action in trespass. So irrespective of whether the legislature has ever spoken to the subject, judge-made law could provide a remedy to beekeepers, just to use them as an example. Sorry, would beekeepers want to? I think Andre's the better person to answer the question of what beekeepers are thinking.
We, you know, I think a lot of people don't look at beekeepers as being farmers necessarily, but of course we are. And we don't want to get into fights with farmers. And in my opinion, that's what the chemical companies want, is they want us fighting. I think if anybody is going to be taken to court here, it's the PMRA, the provincial government, the federal government, the people that allowed, and the chemical companies themselves. I mean, I almost don't blame them. They're sharks, and you can't blame a shark for eating food. That's what they do. But the government is there to protect us, and they're supposed to have protected us from letting these chemicals into our environment in the first place. And I think if there's anyone to sue, that's personally who I'd like to go after, is the Pesticide Management Registration Agency. They should never have allowed these products to be used in the first place. We don't want to fight with other farmers. It's hard for me every time I see corn, when I drive by it, I shake my fist at it and I get angry at the person that planted it. But the system is, it's hard to get mad at that. The farmers are almost serfs for the pesticide companies. They're caught in the middle of it just like us.
It seems like the neonics have come onto the agenda as being a concern relatively recently. Were they using a different kind of pesticide before?
We had organophosphates before, which we all know, DDT, et cetera, is bad. And that was proven, even though they said in the beginning it wasn't, to be bad for birds and animals and mammals and fish and people. They claim that these new class of pesticides are not a problem for people and animals. We're starting to see that in a different light. So they've switched to these under those claims, is that it's not as much of a problem. And I think if they had have stuck to proper, what we call in farming circles, an IPM, an integrated pest management, I don't disagree with pesticides 100%. There are cases where you have infestations. And if they're not looked after, they spread and they become real problems. So if they had used these particular chemicals in a responsible manner, and when they have wireworm or rootworm infestations, which is what they were designed for, and then use them, and only in those cases, it's just like antibiotics. If you get really sick, nothing's making you better, you want antibiotics, but you don't want to wake up every morning and eat antibiotics just in case. And that's what's going on with corn and soybeans, is every seed that goes into the ground, 99% of which in this province has those systemic pesticides on them. And they also synergistically mix them with fungicides, which makes them more powerful. So it's a problem for sure. And they keep saying, we don't want to go back to DDT. Well, I don't want them to go back to DDT either, but I want them to use them responsibly. That's not happening.
We actually featured that last month here at Salon Vert. It was Orange Witness about those who handled DDT in our province.
What I was interested in knowing was, now that we understand that there is this problem, and what would potentially happen to bring back the soil to a state where, say tomorrow the government were to be on board and say, we agree. Yeah, you mentioned 15 years for how long it was in the soil.
Some cases, yes. Some cases 6 months.
Some cases 6 months.
I think it depends on the soil
okay.
type, the conditions, the chemical that's used, et cetera.
Okay.
But I don't know. But we need to start there. We definitely, I mean, there are ways of remediating soil. There are ways of remediating the planet. And the planet will remediate itself just fine once we're gone, But yeah, you're right. We need to do it, and we need to do it soon. It's hard to tell just how long it'll take.
I bring that up because I was at the organic conference, and a farmer stood up and spoke about DDT. And I was pretty ignorant about how it came to be monitored. And he talked about it being taken care of in a couple of ways. The government said there was places for it to be brought to. But he said in cases where the farmer had to take care of it on their own, where they didn't want to, what they did was they buried a certain depth. They encased concrete and they put it in there. And then he talked about how anything below a certain level, I can't remember, it was like several feet, was in the water table. And it was a systemic problem in Ontario, because it was just passing through the water table. And so then he said nothing could be considered organic if it went below this level. So if that particular vegetable or grain went 5 feet and it was below 3, then they couldn't say it was organic. So that I guess that was my real concern for how lethal a place we're getting into with it.
I just wanted to add more bad news because we're not sad enough. But I just, yeah, that is a huge issue. And for those of you who don't know how these chemicals work, they infuse the body of the plant. So every part of the plant has the chemical in it. And so all pollinators that might be feeding on the pollen or collecting the nectar will take that into their bodies. And I just want to mention, I have heard reports of some of the large food chains, grocery store chains in the springtime selling potted plants for the garden that have also been treated with neonics. So I would, if you're a gardener, I would really encourage you to think about organic and to do your research to find out, if you're just picking up a cheap, wonderful plant to help the pollinators in your garden, do check it out and make sure that you're getting it from a source that aren't pre-treating their plants with neonics as well.
I just want to add, too, that how these systemic pesticides get passed or how they slipped under the radar was that in the old days when the crop duster came, it sprayed the fields. When the rains came and washed away, pesticide, you could bring the hives. And how they got that pesticide passed was if you dipped a beneficial insect like a honeybee into it and it died in 24 hours, it was too lethal, it wouldn't get passed. Nowadays, with the systemic pesticides, you dip the beneficial insect into them, and it doesn't die in 24 hours, it dies a week later. So it gets slow poisoning. And this is a lot of the illnesses or something that were touted as just like a person who has AIDS. He doesn't die of AIDS. The coroner's report will not put on the death certificate, he died of AIDS. He died of a common cold or a virus or something else. But because the whole immune system was compromised, he was susceptible, or he or she, to all sorts of common diseases that most people just shake off. But the same thing with the honeybees now, or with the pollinators, is that with this slow poisoning in their poison in their system, they're susceptible to a whole multitude of pathogens that normally they would just have no problem with. And so they're saying it's Israeli perilous virus or this or that or other ailments that are causing the death or the disappearance of the bees. But with the original colony collapse in, I think it was Pennsylvania, with the beekeeper Hackensack, they found there was tremendous systemic pesticide use in the area where he had his hives, and as well organic farms that had no problem, did not have colony collapse disorder that were in the area where his hives had it. And as well, it's like in nature, it's in the great chain of being, every being sacrifices itself to the next, or one thing eats another. And if a hive is abandoned, other predators will come in and just consume it. Let's say wax moths will eat the wax in it, or wasps or ants will eat the honey, or other bees will rob the honey. So these colony collapsed hives were not touched by any other bees or any other insects. And when they examined the pollen and the nectar inside them, they were found to be full of pesticides. So the neonicotinoids. So this was the smoking gun that years ago the beekeepers knew about, but it's just this, it's like throwing in the ink of the octopus in the face of the people in the media from the pesticide companies, saying that it's denial, that it's not. Bayer, for example, who is responsible for the corn spraying, denied it, and the Ontario Beekeeping Association got all the list of all the beekeepers that lost their hives due to the corn spraying, and asked Bayer for compensation. And they said, well, it's not us, it's not our problem, it's the other predators of the bees or other problems that are causing the death of the bees. And so finally they said, we will do some studies, and you can tell what they proposed to the Ontario Beekeeping Association, that we do this study, we'll research, but we have to use our labs and our scientists, and not an independent lab, because ours are the best. And secondly, you have to sign a confidentiality agreement that we will release the results of this study to whom we deem who we would like to only. And thirdly, that we won't study the pesticides, because that's not the cause of the problem. We'll just study other predators of the bee, or mites, or other things like that. So the Ontario Beekeeping Association said, forget it, So they're in a complete state of denial, even though there are, like Andre said, about 150 studies showing direct cause of the systemic pesticides. So this is how they get past the old crop dusting criterion of dipping the beneficial insect into it and it dies in 24 hours is being used with the new systemic pesticides.
Can I just add one point, before I forget it? Okay. Some of Oliver's comments and Andre's comments underscore a problem in Canada, but probably elsewhere as well. The federal law that permits pesticides to be registered in Canada has a regime that is not exactly foolproof in terms of process. I mentioned earlier that the pesticide we've contested the registration of had a renewal of what is known as a conditional registration. Conditional registration is less than a full registration under federal law. Full registration means that all the studies that should be done before a pesticide is registered have been done. Conditional registration, by definition in the statute, means that all the studies that should be done have not yet been done, but we're going to let you use the substance anyway until the work is done. The problem with neonicotinoids is that some of the key studies that the government itself has admitted constitute a critical data gap have actually been outstanding for, in some cases, close to a decade. So it's not like 2 years ago or 8 months ago we finally discovered that, we missed something when we issued this registration. Government of Canada knew in 2003 that there were not chronic toxicity studies for any of the neonicotinoids that were being registered 11 years ago. They've permitted the companies to market these products over the last decade, with the requirement that they would do the studies in the interim to demonstrate whether there was a problem with continuing to use them. The problem is, as the study deadlines approached, and either the work was done but was not valid, or the work wasn't done at all, they renewed or flipped over the conditional registration and permitted it to continue to be used. The current one, which is the one we challenged in September for the one substance where the registration came due, won't have to produce anything until 2015, or the end of 2015, but it's about the third time that product has been given sort of a second and a third lease on life. So one of the problems we have to confront is our law is not very good at controlling the use of agricultural chemicals in this country. And it underscores the problem that in each, over the last 6 decades, every decade or so, we seem to have another problem. In the 50s and 60s, it was DDT, which killed virtually everything it touched. In the 70s and 80s, we had the herbicides 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, which were not great for human health. And now we have in the 2000s the neonicotinoids, which is, has been mentioned, they're a systemic insecticide, which are also persistent in the environment and pretty much are everywhere a bee might go. So one of the things I think we should have learned by now after 6 decades is that agricultural chemicals are not a magic bullet. They're designed to be toxic to something, and eventually they end up being toxic to something other than the target organisms. And so while we have to, in looking backwards, we need to deal with issues of potential compensation for folks who may have been harmed or may become harmed. We also have to, looking forward, change the paradigm and stop focusing on chemicals as the sole answer to dealing with food production, among other things. And part of the answer to that is to reform our law.
I was just going to ask a question about GMOs, because you mentioned corn and soy being the major crops that the pesticides are used on. Is there a relationship there between the GMO crops and the neonicotinoids?
You can genetically modify a crop without, most of these crops, and in this case, they're genetically modified for different reasons. Sometimes it's drought resistance, or that's usually what they talk about when they're marketing these things. But yes, these have indeed been genetically modified to be, in most cases, herbicide resistant, so that you can spray Roundup on the field after it's been planted, and everything else in the field will die except for that target crop or the non-target crop. So if you're spraying Roundup in the whole field, all the weeds will die and the soybean or the corn will not, because it's been genetically modified to be resistant to that particular herbicide or to carry the systemic pesticide. Genetic modification or GMOs are a whole different thing altogether. I'd like to stick on the pesticides, but I think potential there's if in the right hands and not in the hands of people making billions and trillions of dollars, maybe there's some promising work in genetic modification. I think it's a little bit silly. I don't, you let the cat out of the bag with those sort of things, but my main focus is not so much on the GMOs as it is with the systemic pesticides they're using with them, but almost always if they're using a systemic pesticide, it's a genetically modified crop. I don't know of an example where they aren't.
I just wanted to say I really appreciated the film and also your commentary. I've learned a lot already, so thank you very much. My question is around the different levels of yield versus organic or like an integrated pest management system to using the pesticides, and what kind of like math is around that, like the costs of it and the production yields of food based on those different types of production methods, and any commentaries that you have around that.
A lot of good questions there. So part of what there's no real evidence. If you don't have an infestation of a particular pest, then you're not going to benefit with higher yields from using a pesticide crop. Just like you're not going to get any healthier by eating antibiotics. If you're sick and you eat antibiotics, then they will make you better. But if you're not sick, it's not going to make you 10% healthier. It just doesn't work that way. So yes, you will get higher yields if you have an infestation. If you do not, then you will not. Now, on the broader scale of things, I think we have to look at it in a larger picture. If we don't change things, we are not going to get any yields. We do need to go back. We have to suck it up and take lower yields, if that's what it takes, to go back to a more sustainable source of agriculture and feeding people. This can all happen very, very quickly. We have been building up the blueberry growers, the cranberry growers in Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, they have been growing in leaps and bounds. And just like the almond industry, without us, the beekeeper and the commercial beekeeper, they cannot grow. So 5 years ago, they were crying, and they still are, for pollination from us beekeepers. And there's actually dating websites now to marry up beekeepers with cranberry and blueberry growers so that they can quadruple their production by having bees in their crops. So a blueberry grower with 10,000 pounds, he can do 40,000 pounds by having, so it's worth it to them to pay us $200 a colony to move them into there. So they've finally gotten 35,000 colonies out of Ontario in the past 3 years in a row. Well, 2 years. Last year that declined to 30,000. I'm betting that this year it's going to decline to 25 or 20,000. The biggest pollination event in the world, the California almonds, where there's almost 2 million colonies of bees being moved from across the United States and into California to pollinate them. There's 800,000 acres. It takes 3 colonies of bees per acre to pollinate that. And I just came from a beekeepers meeting in Louisiana, and I talked to David Hackenberg. You may have heard his name. He was on Time in 60 Minutes. He's one of the bigger beekeepers as far as pollination in the States. He said, we just don't have the bees we need to go into those almonds. They're willing to pay us $225, $250 a colony, and some of these guys are moving in 20, 30,000 colonies. It is big money. They want to bring the bees in. They just don't have them. They're dying. They're sick. So if me as a beekeeper and all of my other cohorts that are in the business decide, I can't make money at this anymore, I'm done. Well, within 3 or 4 years, you're going to see almonds disappear. And the ones that are left are going to be extremely expensive. Blueberries, cranberries, apples, pears, peaches, plums. This is not 40 years down the road. This is 5 years down the road. It can happen that quickly, and we are that close to it. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is here. So we really do need to take action. I know I'm Mr. Sunshine here, but it can change, and I think that's why I talk so dire about it. It's got to happen quickly, and not just for my benefit, but for everybody's, because our food prices are going to rise, and once that food chain collapses, we're not going to get to 10 billion people, I'm sorry.
Well, Mr. Sunshine, we only have time for a couple of more questions, and I just want to remind you that our volunteers distributed some surveys, so if you could take a moment before you leave this evening and just pass them to our volunteers as you exit, that would be greatly appreciated. Sorry, where was the one more question that we had? Right here. Here?
She had a question too. Exactly what Joe was talking about, and then you as well, was the issue of we have to get off these drugs. It's been 50 years of disaster, and I don't know how much longer it will take, but just like the cities who passed bans and fought through the courts, and then everybody said, oh, it's okay because it's for cosmetic purposes. When are we going to get past this? I can't see that this will happen without a major turnaround within the farming community in rural areas, supported by all the people who eat their food, which is mostly people in cities. And then you can get the kinds of changes that Joe is talking about. Otherwise, I don't see how we're going to get off this, because it's just going to be one stupid drug after another that we find out, gee, it turns out it's bad for us. I mean, really? We're still saying that 50 years later. So I think this is where it has to come from. And since you're the one who's in the community and you're saying it, but how many people around you are saying that?
I don't know, everybody I talk to seems to know the path that we're on. We all know the path that we're on. We just don't know how to fix it. And unfortunately, I mean, human beings, we only change when disaster happens. And I'm afraid that disaster will happen and then we'll change. But there are people out there. I imagine many people in this room are like-minded. There are lots of like-minded people out there that are already implementing those changes. If you look at the National Farmers Union, their policies are incredible. They go further and beyond anything us beekeepers actually have come up with. It's amazing. So there are groups out there, but there is a lot of moneyed interests that want to keep things the way that they are. So we have to try to be aware of where the information we see is coming from. And farming with corn and everything, it's become widgets. It's not just food anymore. You know, it's money and greed.
Okay, so now actually we do have our very last question, which I missed. So it's coming from the front here.
Thanks. Yeah, a little late. Just curious how your reactions are about China and their implementation of humans pollinating plants, and what does that mean to a hobby beekeeper, to farmers, the population growing in China, India, so just curious what your reactions are to that.
I can just add one thing. As far as human pollination goes, we forget that when the bees pollinate, they just don't pollinate only pear orchard like you would see in China there. All the bushes and the shrubs around. All the bushes and the shrubs around and the trees are pollinated by the bees. And so while they would just focus on their particular crop, all this other part of nature is being neglected because the bees have been killed. And so first of all, maybe in our society it's not economically viable to hire so many people to do this pollination, because the bees, they visit each tiny flower about 10 times. And the resulting fruits, they're large, they're well-formed, they're tasty, they're abundant, they're many on a branch, the seed set's good. And so it's a huge loss and also the oxygen in the air is much better with the trees that are pollinated by the bees, the linden, the acacia, that just around the Don Valley from the urban beekeeping, the hives and things. So that I can just add that sometimes we forget that we can just replace the bees, but there's all this other part of nature that they take care of. And the bee too is, for millions of years, the honeybee or the bees have been turning the earth into a paradise. They beautify the whole of nature. They feed everyone. They make it's really, really amazing. And just from this tiny insect, we could learn so much to behave better.
That's beautiful. And I can't add anything to it, but I do. Somebody pointed this out to me, I don't know, a couple years ago. I don't know if you've ever picked up an apple, and it looks like one side of it is a little bit collapsed, like it's kind of squished in, usually at the blossom end, or a berry, like a raspberry or a strawberry, and the tip of the fruit is all tight and it hasn't fleshed out. It's called incomplete pollination. So each one of those little stamens that are inside the flower, this is me geeking out on plants, is responsible for all the fleshy part of that fruit development. So when a bee completely pollinates a flower, that means that every single stamen has been pollinated, every single part of the reproductive organs, and therefore the fullness of the fruit is created. So it's kind of interesting, and when I eat, I find that I'm even more appreciative of the work that they do. Anyway, just a little side note there. I don't have anything else to add, really, except to say that, yeah, it's. I think that your point, Oliver, about that honeybees have been sort of brought into our lives as a domesticated species for a purpose, but there is this enormous world of pollinators out there that are doing these incredible jobs unseen, tiny little insects that are co-evolved with particular plants. So I think it's really important to keep a close eye on what's happening right now with this issue, because we know it has huge impacts, but also be really aware that I mean, as always, your actions, each individual person's actions, makes a huge difference. So how you shop, where you get your seed, where you buy your garden plants, how you design your garden, what you put in your pots on your balcony or in your condo. I mean, bees will fly up. So I've heard of balcony gardens that are full of bees on the 17th floor. So nobody has a reason to say, well, that doesn't include me. And even at your workplaces, or advocate for subway stations or anywhere, we can turn the city into a garden, and it's a place where we can start anyway. Well, these good fellows are figuring out the more complicated work.
If you do nothing else, you should follow the Senate Committee on Agriculture and Forestry is holding hearings on the neonicotinoids. My sense is it should be the other chamber that should be holding these hearings, so you might want to each write to your MP and urge them to have a parliamentary committee examine the issue much more systematically than arguably the Senate committee could. That might help.
Yeah, and give them a call once a week or so, or once a month. Following up phone calls doesn't hurt. They said it well in the movie. I mean, just to give you almonds, it took hundreds of billions of bees to do that job, a month to do that job. So we just can't go there, pollinating our own fruit. I mean, unless we live in our own little tiny reservations. But it's just sad to see that, and that our own, what nature has provided for us cannot provide for us anymore. So we do need to really work on that. And I do, but when I was in the U.S. earlier in the month, I asked somebody from France. I said, "Why is it that every time something goes on in France and people get upset about it, they get out in the streets of Paris in the hundreds of thousands and they fix it? They get mad." And they said, "Well, it's a small country. It takes 2 hours to get from one end of the country to the other. And everybody that's in France can be in Paris and protesting over the weekend. We can't do that here. We can't. It's too big of a country to drive from Vancouver to Ottawa to protest. And maybe other people will show up, maybe they won't. But we do have a pen and pencil. We do have email, and we do have phone calls, and we can." They do listen. They're not going to maybe listen to 65,000 people, but if we keep passing the word around and calling them and letting them know that this is important to us and we need them to look into it more deeply and quickly, maybe we have a chance.
Okay, so part of what we do, so we're out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up here. And part of what we do in Planet in Focus is, yes, we do bring you these sometimes depressing films, but we also do try very much both to inform you and to leave you with some personal actions that you can take to make this situation better. So I think we've had a lot of suggestions here about both contacting your MPP to get Kathleen Wynne to do something, your MP, following the Senate, creating a pollinator garden, and being careful where you buy your plants and thinking about the fact that neonicotinoids are everywhere. So we need to be aware of them. So thank you very much for your engaged participation, and a big hand for our panel here, please. And then I'd just like to wrap up with two things. One is, as I asked, it turns out that a lot of you are not regular Salon Vert attendees, and we would love you to become so. So please join our mailing list outside, and we'll give you information about these. The second thing is Planet in Focus also offers a membership, and if you become a member of Planet in Focus, you get, for your approximately $50 membership, free admission to all 10 of our Salon Verts, which is just an amazing deal. So we encourage you to do that too. Thank you very, very much for coming out on behalf of Planet in Focus, and we hope to see you on February 25th, which is also a Tuesday, for our next presentation, which is Powerful, and a panel on renewable energy. So thank you very much.